Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Laura Moody. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Feed Education and Research. I'm joined by Matt Sutton-Vermeulen and Garth Boyd, both principals at the Context Network. In this webinar, we're going to explore ag carbon markets and why the feed industry should be paying attention to them. With a mission to advance the understanding and trust in a sustainable animal feed and pet food supply chain, iFeeder is serving up this third webinar as a part of a series to inform the industry and raise awareness of our sustainability roadmap project. The project will assess industry stakeholder needs for the animal food industry and help to understand what resources are needed for continuous improvement. Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk to us a little bit about ag carbon markets.
Thank you very much, Laura. We appreciate the opportunity to visit with you and your members this afternoon and talk about ag carbon in general. What we have on this graphic is a simple depiction of the animal protein production cycle, and superimposed over that, the carbon cycle at a very high level. And so if somebody ever asked one of your members around, well, why is this carbon stuff important to us? When you think about this carbon cycle and the way that if you look at 9 o'clock on the clock and you take a look at where soil carbon is and its origin of how that role that soil carbon plays in the carbon cycle itself, and you see how it goes through the production system, and you see how it comes to the animals eventually through the feed ingredients that are put in their rations, and then the fulfillment of that cycle. So it's really fun to know that our animal production industry is really the first example of a circular economy that ever existed on Earth. And it's that beauty of that enrichment of the soil and that continuous improvement that is able to be seen and measured and reported on that is fantastic. Now, this is just the high level graphic of that cycle, and there's so many more details around the characteristics that go into it and the science. But what's really important and evolving for us in our industry is that there's data collection and verification at the core of this, because the value of carbon is becoming very real. And the true value of it, just like any other carbon source, if you think about it, you can buy carbon today, and carbon today, you could buy it for your grill, and it's charcoal. You could buy it for a ring to tell somebody how much you love them in a diamond. And even if you think about diamonds and the quality of diamonds, there's different quality characteristics of carbon everywhere that you look in our economic systems. You guys will be talking some more details about that later on, but just keep on thinking about this high level cycle as we go through our discussions. When it comes to monetization of carbon, or how people turn the concept of carbon into money, it breaks down into two simple buckets. One are the compliance markets. And this has to deal with entities that have a cap on their GHG emissions. The best example of that, and the relevant example in the US, of course, is the California market. The state itself has limitations that it's put on big emitters. And that's enabled a carbon market to come about because they have to purchase credits to deal with any gaps that they have in their commitments to GHG emission reductions. The second side of it has to deal with the voluntary markets. The voluntary markets include the registries as well as programs that are out there, and we'll talk in more detail about those. But these are ways that organizations can come to them and purchase carbon that has been quantified, measured, reported, and verified, that they can then take credit for that purchase to offset their emissions as well. The largest buyers of these credits tend to be large corporations, And there is a lot of leeway in this because the registries write the rules and the protocols. Some people refer to this as the wild, wild west. Others refer to it as just an emerging market that's gaining maturity as it grows and learns from its mistakes. But GHGs in agriculture are not regulated, and that means that all these markets related to agriculture are on a voluntary basis. They're emerging. This slide gives us some examples of players and entities that play an important role today in our voluntary carbon market in the US. If we start at that top row, these are the registries that we talked about. Vera, Climate Action Reserve, American Carbon Registry, the Gold Standard. These are all ways that people can write protocols and issue and certify credits that we talked about. You'll go through a list of some very highly relevant protocols that have been written and are available specific to the feed industry. When it comes to carbon programs, these are not markets themselves, but they're ways to develop and aggregate projects that can bring together larger carbon sources. Think about how volume is brought together or aggregated to make larger purchases available for people that want to purchase bigger size credits. So there's continues to be a proliferation around these programs, and it's nonstop. And they mature and they grow and they're developing and learning from these things every day. Then if you think about the verifiers, and if you think about, again, go back to the diamond market, and there are people that verify the quality of diamonds, the characteristics of those diamonds. Verifiers are responsible for auditing the practices and the outcomes to ensure that there's quality in the carbon itself within the registries and within programs. Then there's intermediaries that people can go to and say, hey, I need to buy 1 million credits. Where can I go? And they pool credits together to get those things. And then, of course, there's the end side of the market and the large entities that are fulfilling their sustainability goals or their corporate social responsibility goals or their ESG goals that they have in public. So this is just a quick high-level framing of that voluntary carbon market. If you think of the flow from creation or the concept, the creation of the concept of carbon specific to agriculture, and then you think of it going to all the way to purchase, that's what this flow is meant to represent. So if we start on that left-hand side in a protocol, it's nothing more than a written set of standards that put guidelines and rules around how a project can be developed. Then, of course, you have to take that protocol and administer it. So farmers are doing that through no-till practices, the practice of using cover crops, and all sorts of different ways today. Then, after those practices are completed, you have to have somebody come along and support the development of those credits by aggregating up projects. In other words, going to multiple farmers with multiple fields, or multiple operations in the case of enteric protocols, and putting together sets and groups. Think of it like commingling and bringing together a bunch of bins of corn or a bunch of calves from an operation. And then you have somebody that overlooks that and looks at the quality of those credits. And that's the verification to ensure that the practices were truly met and the protocol was followed all the way through from start to finish. And then there is a certification system that comes into play on these. And of course, that then gives people confidence in the purchase. Not all carbon is created equal. There's some real good carbon out there, and there's some lumps of coal. Laura, I'm going to hand it back off to you and to visit with my good friend Garth and to have some deeper discussions around this issue of agricultural carbon. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. Garth, you and I, we first worked on a project almost a decade ago together in the carbon space when we were working on a conservation innovation grant. and carbon kind of ebbed and flowed a little bit, but now there's been this amazing explosion in this space relative to agriculture. What's really driving that right now?
I think the interest in activity in soil health and the recognition by a lot of entities that are making commitments to reduce their greenhouse gas footprint emissions. We could go through a long list: Coca-Cola, Microsoft, American Air, the Corsia, which is the International Aviation Group, and many others that are voluntarily trying to reduce their environmental footprint. And the headline is always greenhouse gases. Of course, there's efforts with water and many other metrics, but that has created a lot of interest because many of these companies are very interested in nature-based solutions. Think of an airline. How do they reduce their emissions? There will come the day when they can utilize perhaps biofuels for aviation, and little tweaks here and there with maybe more efficient lighting and things like that. But they do not have the ability to sequester carbon. They emit carbon. With the certain practice changes and technologies, we can not only reduce emissions, but also sequester carbon in the soil. And that's an exciting thing. And there's just been a tremendous amount of enthusiasm and effort around that.
So you gave some examples of corporate America, maybe and global in the transportation space or the logistics space. But when we, at least within the food space, we are seeing a lot of the corporate food companies, the consumer-facing companies, creating science-based targets and commitments. And so what role do they think carbon markets have in their commitments?
Yeah, the carbon markets are very important because the developers will typically utilize a registry. Matt showed us examples of registries and developers and programs. But this slide that just came up here is an example of industry organizations responding to pressure from food retailers, who are responding to pressure from investors on ESG, environmental, social governance metrics on how these companies are performing. And so for these food retailers that are publicly traded, to keep them attractive on the open market to investors, they need to come out aggressive with commitments on environmental issues, and in this case, of course, it's greenhouse gases. So then the industry associations, like National Cattlemen's Beef Association, is committed to climate neutrality by 2040. The dairy industry has committed to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Those are examples of them, standing up, taking a leadership position, and then helping members in the dairy and the beef supply chain figure out how to get that done.
And so we see in the examples that you just gave with dairy and beef, right? Those are now, so we've moved from commitments that the food companies are making to commitments that now the livestock sectors are making. And so what role then do the markets have relative to the members of those livestock sectors? Like what's the role of the carbon markets for those commitments?
Right. That's a great question. So some of these practices are expensive. Farmers and ranchers have to be incentivized, rewarded to implement more expensive practices, or practices that, for instance, no-till. Farmers are telling us that, you're going to have reduced production, maybe years 1, 2, 3, 4. It might be year 5 before you get back to the level of production that you were seeing when you were doing, tillage year in and year out. So they've got to be compensated for that because of that soil carbon that they're sequestering in the soil through this practice change. They have to be incentivized to do that. And so these markets are bringing in money from sectors sometimes completely outside the food chain to agriculture and creating these practice changes or technology implementation. And so agriculture is a solution provider for climate change. But without these markets, the uptake, the adoption of these technologies and or practice changes would not be nearly what it is with the advent of these new markets.
So when we look at the carbon markets, so you talked about incentives for practice change, then what do the carbon markets look like for the livestock sector as well as specific to the feed industry?
Thanks for asking. Matt showed a slide, the carbon cycle of livestock production. And at this point, there's really two main areas that have potential. Well, one is definitely, creating carbon credits, and that's manure. The destruction of methane from livestock manure. There has long been a protocol that's been approved by the California Air Resources Board for compliance grade carbon credits to be traded in the California Air Resources Board marketplace. And that is, so basically covering manure lagoons or implementing anaerobic digesters and destroying that methane that would otherwise be emitted to the atmosphere. That is that has generated many, many millions of dollars for primarily dairy farmers, also hog farmers, but even a poultry operation that handled the manure wet, like at a layer operation. Anywhere in the country can qualify, if they follow the rules and create carbon credits that can be traded in California. So that's one example on the manure side. On the enteric methane side, for ruminants, we're talking dairy and beef cattle. A lot of methane is emitted, like for a dairy cow, 3 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per cow per year. And there are feed additives that are being researched and are coming to market, as well as some existing feed additives. And there are 2 protocols right now, one that exists with Vera and one that exists with the gold standard, which is basically a set of rules for how you, as a livestock, as a dairy farmer or a cattleman, can generate credits should you use a feed additive that qualifies, based upon the protocol.
So we're looking at this slide that shows several different types of practices, and that means there's several different ways that carbon is being emitted, either from methane, basically we're reducing methane losses or nitrous oxide losses, or we're sequestering carbon. And those all have different kind of levels of permanence or certainty around them. Does permanence have an impact on what a contract looks like for a farmer that's looking to use one of these credit markets?
Yeah, good question. It sure does. If you're looking at soil carbon sequestration, most contracts, and again, thinking about the slide that Matt showed with the many new players oftentimes in this space, Indigo, Bayer, Corteva, Nutrien, SIBO, others, they have contract lengths varying anywhere from a year to 10 years. That's requiring the farmer to agree to implementing a practice change. And, the most relevant example is quit plowing the field or only use strip till or no till. And that action right there will increase soil carbon sequestration. With regard to enteric, the avoided emission of methane is permanent. Today that cow did not burp. That cow burped maybe 30% less methane than they would have if they had not consumed the feed additive in that total mixed ration. So, if I'm a buyer of carbon credits, the carbon credit generated from the use of a feed additive I'm very confident in that, and it's permanent. Whereas if I buy a soil carbon credit, there's ways of trying to increase the buyer's confidence through insurance or what they call a buffer pool. But definitely there's differences.
So because this webinar is kind of for the feed-facing audience, for the feed industry audience, why should they keep paying attention to the carbon market space, or why should they start paying attention to the ag carbon market space, other than kind of the enteric emission piece?
Because it's growing. It's this market is projected to be, I think, around $200 billion by 2030, and it's going to grow from there. It's hard to connect, to the media today without seeing another corporation or another industry association making public commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Climate change, everybody's got to do their part. Every sector of society's got to do their part to try and reduce our emissions. And the feed industry is a very important part of the livestock industry. And so the AFIA association and members need to pay attention to this, because it's going to impact your members' profitability and actions that they're taking. So get on board.
Garth, thanks so much for some candid responses and giving us some of your insights into ag carbon. Matt, I'll ask you to come back on with your camera and see if you have any closing thoughts from what you heard Matt and I talk about, or Garth and I talk about, or if you've got other questions, another question for Garth.
No, Laura, as I think about the relevance to your members and your iFeeder investors, it goes back to being ready, getting ready, and being in control of your own destiny, or somebody else being in control of your destiny. And so I think your sustainability roadmap is going to enable them to look at where they are in their sustainability journey, and are they ready to answer questions about their contribution to the footprint, not just around GHG, but their responsible way that they manage their business, their people, the environment, the animals that they're responsible for. We're all part of this stuff, and people want to know that they can feel good about what they're putting on their plate or how they're taking care of somebody's pet. And it gets back to that peace of mind and trust that we all want to have in the food supply chains that we're dealing with. So that to me is the essence of it: trust and accountability, and being proud of what you do and how you do it.
Great. Well, thanks, Matt and Garth, to both of you for being a part of this third webinar in our series that we've had underway. We've mentioned multiple times in this webinar and others the Sustainability Roadmap Project. We're excited that we're actually going to be initiating work on that project in October versus just talking about it as we have been for the last couple of months. If you'd like to know more information about that project, you can reach out to me. My email and phone number are here on the slide, or you can go to ifeeder.org and check out our sustainability page. As I have mentioned before, iFeeder, we are a foundation. A project of this scale and scope takes some resources to carry out. And so if you have the ability and interest in participating in this project and contributing to its success, I'd love to talk to you about some resources for that. So thanks for joining us again for this third part in the series. If you have not had a chance to catch the first two webinars, again, you can find those on the sustainability webpage as well. Thanks again, and have a great day.